Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time, we're going deep into the world of deep tech startups, but with a twist.
A twist is okay.
Yeah, we're not getting all, geeky about the tech itself. Instead, we'll be looking at something that often gets overlooked, but it's super important:
I like it.
corporate culture. And to help us unpack all this, we've got some amazing insights from Dr. Ari Masudi. He spent years studying what makes these ventures tick, and he's got some seriously interesting stuff to share.
Oh, absolutely. Dr. Masudi's work really challenges the idea that just because you have amazing tech, you're automatically going to be successful.
Hmm.
He makes a strong case that even the most, revolutionary product can completely flop if it doesn't fit into the bigger picture, the culture.
Okay, so it's not enough to just build something cool. You also need to understand the culture of the people you're trying to reach.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
And it's not just your target audience either. It's your own team as well.
Right, your internal culture, too. So, like, how everyone works together, their values, all of that.
Yeah. Like Dr. Masudi talks about this med tech entrepreneur, Sarah, who, she developed this product. It was objectively better than anything else out there, but she hit a wall trying to get doctors to use it.
Really?
Yeah.
What happened?
So it wasn't that the tech was flawed or anything. It was a culture clash. The product just didn't fit with how doctors work. Their routines, their beliefs about patient care. They're really busy, naturally cautious, and all that.
Makes sense. I mean, you don't want to mess around with healthcare.
Exactly.
So even though her product was technically better, it didn't mesh with their world.
Nope.
It's kind of like that company Dr. Masudi mentions that tried to implement this, fancy new project management software.
Oh, yeah, the one where the employees just refused to use it, even though it was supposed to be amazing, all the bells and whistles.
Yeah, it wasn't that the software was bad or anything. It just didn't fit with how they were used to working, their habits and workflow.
Yeah, classic example of internal cultural resistance. You can't just force change on people without considering the existing culture.
So how do we even begin to understand this culture thing? It's so, I don't know, intangible.
Well, Dr. Masudi gives us a really cool tool to work with, this 7-layer model. It's like a framework for understanding any group culture, whether it's your company or like the broader market you're targeting.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about these 7 layers.
All right, so we have practices, protocols, principles, values, beliefs, identity, and purpose.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. We're definitely going to have to dive into each of those.
Oh, for sure. But before we get into the specifics, I think it's important to take a step back and see the bigger picture, what Dr. Masudi's really getting at. He's saying that deep tech founders, they need to balance that microscopic focus on the technical details with a more telescopic view of the culture around them.
So you can't just be obsessed with how the tech works. You have to zoom out and see how it fits into the world.
Exactly.
Huh.
He makes this great analogy to being a chef. You need to know the individual ingredients, but also how they come together to make a delicious dish. It's the same for deep tech founders. They need to master the tech, but also understand the cultural context.
That makes sense. And it's not saying ditch the technical expertise, right? It's more like adding this cultural understanding as another tool in your toolkit.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And here's another key point. Culture's not static. It's alive, always changing, influenced by all these different forces. So deep tech leaders, they need to anticipate these changes and be ready to adapt.
That's true. It's like technology changes culture, but then culture changes how tech develops, this kind of back and forth.
Yeah, you got it.
That's why it's so important for deep tech startups to really have a good grasp of those cultural trends, right?
Exactly. Failing to do so, can lead to a product that's amazing on paper, but totally misses the mark culturally. And that's a recipe for disaster.
So how do we keep our finger on the pulse of culture? What should we be paying attention to?
That is a great question. And that's something we'll explore further when we start going through each of these 7 layers.
Okay, so let's circle back to Dr. Masudi's 7-layer model. We threw out a bunch of terms like practices, protocols, principles, but what do they actually mean for a deep tech startup in the real world?
Right, let's break it down. Starting with practices, which is kind of like the outer layer. Think of it as the things you can actually see, the tangible aspects of the company's culture.
So for a deep tech startup, would this be things like how they show off their tech at conferences, the feel of their website, or even the way they explain their innovations, the language they use?
Exactly. It's all about that first impression, the outward image they project. And Dr. Masudi, he really emphasizes that this layer, the practices, they have to be genuine, congruent with the company's core values. If they're not, if there's a mismatch, it can really damage trust and hurt the company.
Right, it's like putting on a front, a facade. If it doesn't match what's actually going on underneath, people can sense that. It feels fake.
Yeah, it's like imagine trying to build a sustainable fashion brand, but you're packaging everything in plastic.
Oof. Yeah, that's not going to fly with eco-conscious consumers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, think about a company like Patagonia. They're all about environmental sustainability, and that's reflected in everything they do. Their products, their marketing, everything.
Yeah, their practices really align with their deeper values. And that's smart not just for attracting customers who share those values, but also for building that strong internal culture, right?
Absolutely. It sends a powerful message both inside and outside the company. Now, moving inward, the next layer is protocols. These are like the established ways of doing things, the unspoken rules that govern how work gets done.
So, like meeting procedures, communication styles, how decisions are made, all that kind of behind the scenes stuff.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that these protocols, they can either make it easier or harder for a company to innovate.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Especially in deep tech, you have to be adaptable, right?
hmm
Able to shift gears quickly when things change.
Exactly. If your protocols are too rigid, too bureaucratic, it can stifle that agility.
I guess that's why you see companies like Spotify who are constantly changing and adapting their products, adopting those flatter, less hierarchical structures. Their protocols are built for speed and flexibility.
You got it. It's a great example of how different layers of culture interact and influence each other. Okay, so let's go deeper now to the principles layer. This is where things get really interesting because we're talking about the fundamental values that guide a company's actions, what they stand for.
This is the bedrock, the guiding principles that determine like everything, right?
Exactly. These principles, they influence everything from how they develop products to who they hire, how they interact with the world. Like going back to Patagonia, their core principle is environmental sustainability,
Yeah.
and everything they do stems from that.
Okay, so for a deep tech startup, this could be a commitment to open source technology, data privacy, ethical AI development, stuff like that.
Absolutely. Those are all great examples. And what this model really helps us see is how these deeper values, these principles, actually show up in the company's practices and protocols.
Right, it's all connected. And those connections can reveal whether a company is actually living by their values or just, paying lip service.
Precisely. Now, the next layer, values, this gets a bit more nuanced
hmm
because we're going beyond those explicitly stated principles and into like the realm of shared beliefs and assumptions.
So this is where it starts to feel more like that intangible, almost invisible culture we were talking about.
Exactly. And it's crucial for deep tech founders to understand this layer because it really shapes how people within the company see the world, make decisions, how they interact with each other.
Can you give us an example of how this plays out, in a real company?
Sure. Dr. Masudi talks about Tesla and how they challenged the assumption that electric cars had to be boring and impractical. Their values, their belief in the potential of electric vehicles to be both high performance and stylish, that completely shook up the car industry.
It's a perfect example of how challenging those deeply ingrained cultural beliefs can lead to some truly innovative stuff. It's like they weren't just building cars, they were changing the whole story around electric vehicles.
Yeah, and that shift in the narrative, that's what ultimately led to their success. It's not just about understanding what people do, but why they do it and what beliefs might be shaping their behavior.
Wow, I'm starting to see how powerful this model can be for understanding what's really going on within a company, even those hidden dynamics. But we're only at layer 4, right? There are 3 more to go. Okay, so we've gone through practices, protocols, principles, and values. We're really getting into the nitty-gritty of a company's culture here. What's next in Dr. Masudi's model?
Right, so the next layer is beliefs. And this is where things get super interesting. See, values, those are like the broader ideals, the aspirations of a company. But beliefs, those are more about the specific assumptions and convictions that guide, everyday decision making.
So it's like the difference between saying we're all about sustainability versus we believe that using recycled materials is the best way to reduce our environmental impact.
Exactly. Beliefs are more practical, more grounded in what the company actually does. And here's why this is so important for deep tech startups. This beliefs layer, it can either really help or really hurt innovation.
Oh, interesting. Can you give us an example?
Sure, let's say you have a deep tech startup that's working on like cutting edge AI. Now, if their underlying belief is that humans always need to be involved in AI development, that's going to shape everything they do. They'll focus on transparency, making sure the AI is explainable, and building in strong safety mechanisms.
But if they believe that, pushing AI efficiency is more important than those things, they might be more likely to take shortcuts or, like, downplay the risk.
Exactly. Their beliefs will show up in like what they choose to research, how they design their products, even who they hire.
That's a great example of how this layer of culture, even though it might seem kind of abstract, can have some very real consequences.
Oh, absolutely. And it shows why it's so crucial for deep tech leaders to be aware of their own beliefs, but also the beliefs within their industry and the wider culture.
Okay, two more layers to go. What's next?
All right, so the sixth layer is identity. This is all about how a company sees itself and how it wants the world to see it.
So, kind of like the company's brand personality, the story they tell about who they are,
Exactly. And in deep tech, where everything's about innovation and disrupting the status quo, having a strong identity is huge.
because it helps them stand out from the competition.
Yeah, but it's more than that. A strong identity gives employees a sense of belonging, a purpose. It attracts customers who share the company's values, and it helps guide decision-making at every level.
It's like that saying, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. A company needs that clear sense of self to navigate the market, right?
Exactly. And finally, we reach the heart of Dr. Masoudi's model, purpose. This is like the deepest layer, the fundamental reason why the company exists.
This is the big why, right?
It is. It's the North Star that guides every decision, every action. It's what gives everyone in the company a sense of meaning and motivation.
And for a deep tech startup, this purpose usually goes beyond just making money. It's about pushing boundaries, solving big problems, making a real difference in the world.
Exactly. And when a company has that clear, compelling purpose, it creates this incredible alignment across all the other layers of culture.
So this is that perfect harmony Dr. Masoudi talks about, where all seven layers are working together.
You got it. It's like an orchestra where each instrument is playing in tune and it creates this beautiful symphony. And when that happens, well, you get that magic formula for success. You attract top talent, you get amazing innovation, and you build a company that's not just profitable, but truly impactful.
This model has been so helpful for understanding what culture really means, especially for deep tech startups. But it's a lot to digest. So for someone listening who wants to start using these ideas, where should they begin?
I think the most important thing is to start with yourself. As a leader, ask yourself, what are my core beliefs? What's the purpose that drives me? What kind of identity do I want for my company? Once you have a better handle on your own, like cultural DNA, then you can start shaping the culture of your company more intentionally.
So there's an inside out approach, starting with the founder and then building out from there.
Yeah, exactly. And remember, culture isn't something you just set and forget. It
Yeah.
takes constant work. You have to keep observing, reflecting, and adjusting.
It's like tending a garden, right? You got to keep nurturing it, pulling out the weeds, making sure it gets enough sun and water.
I love that analogy. And just like a garden, a healthy company culture needs that constant care and attention to really flourish.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of corporate culture. It's been a really eye-opening conversation.
The pleasure was all mine. And remember, folks, building a great company culture is a journey, not a destination. So take what you've learned today and start planting those seeds.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.